Welcome to 50/50 Day, continuing live stream of amazing people. Right now we've got Kimberlé Crenshaw, and a landmark professor of legal studies around race, gender, civil rights, and you have a dual appointment at UCLA and Columbia. I want to jump right in with a question of intersectionality. This is something you termed, and it has become so critical to where we are today in discussing gender and all of the other forms of identity in the sphere of the civic space. So if you were talking to, say, a group of middle school students who were trying to wrap their brains around intersectionality, how would you explain it?
Well, I would use the metaphor of intersectionality quite literally, since that was I was trying to explain how Black and female subjected both to racism and to sexism. So I would just say, you know, imagine you are trying to navigate, you're trying to get to point A, and you have to go through a very busy intersection with traffic coming in all different directions. And your challenge is to try to avoid the traffic that's basically coming down on you at the same time. How would you go about that? What would you need the drivers to do? What would you need other people to help you to do in order to navigate that treacherous space? That's how I would start to talk about it.
Yeah, and so we're really, you know, a lot of times now thinking about how it is that we can deal with the fact that we are allies to each other as women and men, but then we also have other identities that affect our lives. So how do you think in our times, as we look at gender parity and gender equality, that we can push a notion of allies that is not false and not kind of too pat and too small, but really acknowledges some of the challenges we have?
Well, I think the first step is to recognize that intersectionality is not simply another call for like diversity politics. It's not just you know, how many different colors of marbles are in the jar kind of approach to diversity, but instead, which marbles are on the top, which marbles are on the bottom. It's not just about difference, it's a matter of power. And that's one of the challenges I think that we have in a lot of the allyship conversations that tend to be influenced by this sort of weakened idea around diversity. We have to be able to say that these are structures that position us differently with respect to each other. It's not just, you know, we want to make sure that we celebrate equally, you know, March Women's History Month, April Latino History Month. It's really about how does history place us in these institutions in a way that disadvantages some of us and advantages others of us. If we can be allies around that conversation, then we're in a better position to be allies about the actions that need to be taken to help us navigate these spaces better.
And of course, you know, since you developed this whole idea of intersectionality, we have entered the world of social media, and you've been active in looking at the way that social media campaigns can affect social justice with campaigns like Say Her Name. And so why have you been active in that space?
Well, I think one of the amazing things about social media is that it has created a workaround traditional media, which has, for as long as I've been writing, not had the capacity to actually think in intersectional terms about virtually anything. So social media is another space where people can be reached on issues that are not really being fairly represented either by the media or by, frankly, some of the civil rights groups, gender justice groups. So you mentioned Say Her Name. Say Her Name really became more of a movement when it was picked up by people on Facebook, on Twitter. We were able to actually get the names of African-American women who were killed by the police from social media. So it is another public square that is more democratized. We have greater access to it, and consequently that can be a space where intersectional sensibilities have much more traction.
This is such an intense political time, and we are having 50/50 Day after The FBI director, Comey, was released by the president. There's just a lot of turmoil about exactly where we are as a society. But your history with national politics goes back very far, including to the Anita Hill case, where you helped represent Anita Hill in the hearings around the confirmation of Clarence Thomas in 1991. How do you make sense of our time and the idea that we can move towards an era of increasing gender equity and parity, but that we have these challenges to face?
Well, there's so many ways that fateful episode in American history, the nomination and confirmation of Clarence Thomas, is every bit a part of what has happened today. So there's a negative piece and then perhaps a more positive piece. The negative piece is that his confirmation created a Supreme Court that gave us Citizens United and turned a political system that was already too influenced by money into basically a market rather than a democracy. He's also the member of the Supreme Court that gave us Shelby County versus US, which basically, Alabama, which basically meant that we don't have the Voting Rights Act anymore. And this election was largely decided by a margin that was far smaller than the number of people who were disenfranchised. So one thing to just learn is historical losses in one period can become magnificent losses in another period. So this is all part of a wider arc of history in which the dismantlement of the civil rights infrastructure, the dismantlement of democracy has led to this particular moment. I would say the flip side is this. One of the things that happened around the Anita Hill Clarence Thomas hearing was that women finally did see the importance of engaging in politics. Women across the country were incensed by the treatment of Anita Hill by that old boys club that was otherwise known as the Senate Judiciary Committee. And that prompted a groundswell of participation in the system. It led us to the first African-American woman senator in history. So we do know that the possibilities of our backlash is empowerment. The question is the infrastructure there for this groundswell to actually turn into political power? And that, frankly, turns our attention to the fight that's happening within the Democratic Party around, do we need to move more to our base, which includes women and people of color and immigrants and working people, or do we need to move more to the center? So now that we're fighting for the heart and the future, I think, of our democracy inside the Democratic Party.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And also, obviously, many people influence what happens at the Supreme Court. All of the groups that file briefs on behalf of various plaintiffs and defendants and all the lawyers who go in. But in the end, it's the justices who make the decision. I'm sure you're keeping your eye on the Supreme Court. How do you engage with making sense of what might lie ahead for gender issues that make it to the court?
I have to say that the Supreme Court issue is one of the most frustrating issues, I think, of our time, partly because progressives have just not been nearly as successful as conservatives in conveying to their base the absolute fundamental importance of the Supreme Court. There is no reason in the world why this election should have gone the way it went. Had everybody been aware that the Supreme Court sits at the fault line of every significant issue that we're fighting over. So that fifth vote is the difference between whether we will have campaign finance, whether women will have a free choice, whether institutions can still maintain diversity and affirmative action, whether the environment will be safe. 9 people control all the fundamental decisions that we have been fighting about. So I am hoping, again, in the same way that the Clarence Thomas confirmation actually shaped the future of the country for the next 20 years, that people will be able to see the importance of the court and began the important process of galvanizing the understanding that we need. Even if you don't like the presidential candidate, you will like less what the Supreme Court will do. So I think this next 4 years, I want this to be one in which every decision that's made by the Supreme Court that harms the interests of progressive people becomes a controversial issue, that we understand from case to case to case what this court is able to do to undermine our lives, so that the next time we have a chance to push back, we take that chance, regardless of how we actually feel about the Democratic candidate.
So who inspires you when you think about all the heavy lifting that you do and all the amazing work that you do? Who inspires you? Who keeps you going, dead or alive? You know, somebody who just makes your soul sing.
Marianne Williams Crenshaw is my mother. She's no longer with me, but she was a 20th century race woman from the moment she became conscious to the last breath she drew. All of my friends basically say that I have become her. She was a school teacher for 50 years. She taught music. That's formally what she taught. But inside that class, she taught Black history. She taught geography. She taught math. She taught English. She taught self-esteem. She taught Black pride. So, you know, she was an uncompromising but loving person. And very clear in being able to identify social injustice, both against people that she loved and people that she didn't know, and, you know, was willing to be the only person, if it needed to be, to call out something in our small little town of Canton, Ohio, that she saw as unjust and unfair. So I like to think of myself as her living legacy.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm sure that you pass that on to so many people. And one thing that is talked about in the 50-50 Day film is this idea of mentoring as a way of helping everyone, but especially women and girls have not always had access to the same mentoring as you know, as men and boys. So tell me a little bit about, I'm sure that you've been a mentor to people. What does that mean to you?
Well, you know, I have about 20 years ago, actually, this is the 20th year of my effort to actually institutionalize intersectionality, critical race theory inside of a space where young people who want to dedicate their lives to fighting in a way that is responsive to some of the issues facing women and girls of color in particular, and those others who love women and girls. So the African American Policy Forum is the place that I do most of the outreach and development and mentoring work. We have internships every year. We have a staff of about 7 people, and then partners all over the country in which we visit and do town halls. We've done 11 town halls across the country, basically to provide the space for women and girls of color to actually refute the lie that women and girls of color are doing okay. That was primarily the fight that we were having over the last couple of years with the White House over My Brother's Keeper, which was an important thing to do, but it suggested that women and girls of color also are not being left behind. So we began going around the country to talk to people and provide an opportunity for people to talk to their families, their communities, their churches. And out of that, we realized that there was a need for more mentorship, for more skills training, for a community to develop around the idea that we have a story to tell. And what we want to do is create the skills necessary to do it. So we have a Breaking the Silence summer camp every year, in which we bring 50 women and girls of color across the age spectrum, because it's not just young women who have issues, it's middle-aged women and it's older women. And in this space, we create community and we teach people how to do a town hall, how to do spoken word, how to do an op-ed, how to do a video documentary or a podcast. That is the way that we create space where everyone can actually mentor each other and support each other. So that's the kind of thing that, you know, I say my day job is teaching law, but my passion is lifting up women, girls, femmes, and all others who support an idea, the imperative of an intersectional vision of social justice.
Well, that's a beautiful place to leave it. Kimberly, thank you so much. Again, you're the founder and director of the African American Policy Forum, a law professor at UCLA and Columbia, and the person who coined intersectionality, a term that really describes our era today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.